Meadowbrook has always prided itself on the fact that everyone knows everyone else. This town of 8,000 people is nestled among the hills of northern Ohio, where the main attractions are a 1960s water tower, 2 traffic lights on Main Street, and an old mill converted into an antique store. People didn't lock their doors, neighbors brought pies to newcomers, and local disputes were usually limited to arguments over who should mow the grass near the church. The Miller family seemed like the embodiment of the American dream in miniature. Their 2-story house with white shutters and a neatly trimmed lawn was located on Maple Street, just a few blocks from the town center. Deborah Miller was watering petunias in hanging pots when her neighbor, Mrs. Coleman, waved to her from her garden. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" the elderly woman called, wiping her dirty hands on her garden apron. "Wonderful," Deborah replied, squinting against the morning sun. At 47, she had retained her slim figure and soft features, although the last few years had left fine wrinkles around her eyes. Her chestnut hair was neatly pulled back into a low ponytail, a practical hairstyle for 12-hour shifts at the hospital. Meadowbrook Regional Hospital was a small 50-bed facility where Deborah had worked as a nurse for 23 years. She knew every patient, every doctor, every medical history. Her colleagues respected her for her professionalism and humanity. She never raised her voice, but always got the job done. "Mrs. Miller," Dr. Harris said to her during his morning rounds, "Mrs. Johnson in room 12 asked specifically for you. She says you're the only one who knows how to give injections properly." Deborah smiled as she checked the patient's chart. Eleanor Johnson had been here for a week with complications from gallbladder surgery. The 70-year-old woman was known in town for her difficult personality, but she was like an obedient granddaughter with Deborah. "She just needs a little extra attention," Deborah said as she headed for the ward. At her age, the hospital can be scary. It was this ability to see the person behind the diagnosis that made Deborah a special nurse. She remembered her regular patients' birthdays, took an interest in their families, and always found time to listen. But this gift of empathy had a dark side. Deborah felt other people's pain too deeply, often forgetting her own needs. At 6 o'clock in the evening, she parked her red 2018 Honda Accord near her house and saw that Richard's car wasn't there. This didn't surprise her. Her husband often stayed late at the car dealership, especially at the end of the month when he had to meet his sales quota. Richard Miller was a manager at Meadowbrook Motors, the only car dealership in town that sold used cars and provided repair services. A tall man with silver hair and a charming smile, he knew how to win over any customer. In his 20 years on the job, Richard had earned a reputation as an honest salesman, which was rare in their business. "Is Dad late again?" Emily asked, peeking out of the kitchen as Deborah entered the house. At 23, Emily Miller was almost an exact copy of her mother in her youth. The same chestnut hair, the same green eyes, the same soft smile. After college, she returned to Meadowbrook and got a job at the town library. Many considered it a waste of her education, but Emily loved her job. She organized children's reading programs, helped seniors learn how to use computers, and dreamed of turning the old library building into a modern community center. "End of the month," Deborah explained, taking off her work shoes. "You know how it is." "Kayla's coming over for dinner," Emily said, stirring something in a pot. "I hope you don't mind. I made your favorite stew." Kayla Thompson had been Emily's best friend since kindergarten. The 2 girls had grown up practically as sisters, spending countless hours at the Miller's house because Kayla's mother was often away. Now, at 22, Kayla worked as a waitress at Diamond Cafe, a popular spot on Main Street where locals gathered to discuss the news and gossip over a cup of coffee. Unlike the calm and level-headed Emily, Kayla was the embodiment of energy and unpredictability. Her blonde hair always looked slightly tousled, as if she had just gotten out of bed or returned from a party. Her bright makeup, short skirts, and loud laughter attracted the attention of every man within a few miles. "Of course, I don't mind," Deborah replied, although deep down she sometimes worried about Kayla's influence on her daughter. "She's like family." And that was true. After Kayla's mother died in a car accident 5 years ago, the Millers had essentially adopted the orphaned girl. Deborah helped her with college paperwork. Richard taught her to drive, and Emily was always there for her during difficult times. Kayla showed up around 7, bursting into the house with her usual energy. "Hi, Mrs. M," she exclaimed, hugging Deborah. "How's it going at the hospital?" Did you save anyone's life today?" "Just a normal day," Deborah smiled. "How's it going at the cafe?" "Oh, don't ask." Kayla rolled her eyes dramatically. "Mr. Benson tried to pinch me again, you know. I had to remind him that his wife reads in our book club." Emily laughed. "You're hopeless. One day someone's going to get you killed with those jokes." "Then you'll tell everyone what a great friend I was." Kayla winked. Over dinner, the conversation turned to weekend plans, a new movie at the local theater, and gossip about the mayor possibly running for re-election. It was the usual routine of an ordinary family in an ordinary town. Richard came home at 8:30, apologizing for being late. "God, what a day," he said, kissing Deborah on the cheek. "Hi, girls. Kayla, how are you?" "Great, Mr. M," she replied, and Deborah noticed how Kayla's eyes lit up when she looked at Richard. But it was a fleeting observation, quickly forgotten in the rush of everyday concerns. Richard looked tired but satisfied. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, the typical look of a man who had spent a long day convincing people to buy cars they probably couldn't afford. "How were sales?" Deborah asked, warming up his dinner. "Not bad. Sold that Toyota to the Davises. Young couple expecting their first child. Nice people." That was another trait Deborah appreciated in Richard. He never tried to sell people something they didn't need. In the world of used cars, such honesty was rare. After dinner, Kyle helped clear the table, and then the girls went to Emily's room to watch a movie. Richard settled into his chair with a beer and a newspaper, and Deborah started the laundry. It was a typical Tuesday in the Miller household. Quiet, predictable, safe. No one could have guessed that in a few weeks their world would collapse, leaving behind only the wreckage of shattered trust and irreplaceable loss. Later, Deborah would remember that evening as the last moment of true happiness in their home. The last time she looked at her husband and saw a reliable partner, not a stranger. The last time Kayla was just her friend's daughter, not a source of pain. But that evening, she simply folded the clean laundry, checked that the doors were locked, and kissed her husband goodnight, unaware that their perfect life was already beginning to crack at the seams. Deborah's first suspicions arose 3 weeks later, on one of those rainy October days when gray clouds hung over Meadowbrook like a dirty blanket. She was standing by the window of the hospital cafeteria, watching the raindrops run down the glass, when she noticed a familiar red Ford Mustang in the parking lot across the street. Richard's car. It was strange. The car dealership was on the other side of town, and Richard had no reason to be in the hospital district in the middle of the workday. Deborah squinted, trying to make out the silhouette behind the wheel, but the tinted windows prevented her from seeing anything. "Something interesting?" asked her colleague Linda, approaching with a cup of coffee. "No, I thought so," Deborah replied, turning away from the window. But a feeling of unease settled in her chest like a splinter. When she came out for her lunch break, the car was gone. At home that evening, Richard looked his usual self, a little tired but content. Over dinner, he talked about a difficult client who couldn't decide between 2 used SUVs. He ended up buying both, Richard laughed. He says one is for his wife and the other is for his teenage son. It's been a good month. Deborah nodded and smiled in all the right places, but deep down she analyzed his every word, his every gesture. Was he being too talkative? Was he avoiding her gaze? She hated herself for these thoughts, but she couldn't stop. "Were you in the hospital district today?" she asked as casually as possible, serving dessert. Richard froze for a moment, the spoonful of apple pie suspended halfway to his mouth. "The hospital district? No, why?" "No reason. I thought I saw your car." "Must have been someone else's. You know how many red Mustangs there are around here." That was true. Richard always said that a red Mustang was the best advertisement for a car dealer. "I'm selling a lifestyle, not just a car," he would explain to his customers. But Deborah knew his car. She knew the scratch on the rear bumper from when Emily was learning to park. She knew the sticker of the local baseball team on the rear window. It was definitely his car. Over the next few days, Deborah found herself looking for signs of what? Infidelity? The word was difficult to even think about. Richard had never given her any reason to be jealous. 24 years of marriage, and she had never doubted his fidelity. But something had changed. He was staying late at work more often. He started taking showers as soon as he got home, even though he used to be able to walk around in his work clothes all evening. His phone was always face down, and when it rang, Richard would go into another room. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked, finding her mother standing at the sink with an unwashed plate in her hands for the last 10 minutes. "Of course, dear. I'm just tired." Emily hugged her shoulders. "Maybe you should take some time off. You've been working non-stop for months." Deborah leaned against her daughter, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo. Emily had always been her rock, her reason for living. The thought that her family problems could affect her daughter was unbearable. On Saturday, the situation worsened. Richard said he was going to the car dealership to check on a new shipment of cars that were supposed to be delivered that morning. Deborah decided to go to the mall in the next town to buy a gift for her niece, whose birthday was in a week. As she drove past Meadowbrook Motors, she saw that the parking lot was empty. No new cars, no signs of Saturday work. The office was locked and the blinds were down. Deborah's heart began to race. She parked across the street and took out her phone. "Hi, honey," Richard answered after the third ring. Soft music and voices could be heard in the background. "How are the new cars?" "The delivery's been delayed. You know how it is with transport companies. I'll probably be here another couple of hours." "Okay, see you at home." Deborah sat in her car for another half hour, staring at the empty car lot. Where was he? With whom? And why had he lied to her? Meanwhile, without realizing it, Kayla was becoming an increasingly noticeable presence in the Miller home. She stopped by almost every day, either to ask for advice about work or just to chat with Emily. But Deborah began to notice that the girl's gaze lingered more and more on Richard. "Mr. M, you look especially handsome today," Kayla said on Wednesday evening when Richard came home wearing a new tie. "Thank you, Kayla. It's a gift from my wife," he smiled. But Deborah noticed that he didn't look at her when he said it. "You have excellent taste, Mrs. M," Kayla continued. "Right, Mr. M?" "Absolutely," Richard agreed, and this time his gaze lingered on Kayla's a little longer than necessary. Deborah felt nauseous. Was she being paranoid? Or was she really seeing what she thought she was seeing? On Thursday, Kayla showed up with a bag from an expensive clothing store. "I bought a new dress," she announced, showing off a short black dress with a plunging neckline. "What do you think?" "It's very pretty," Emily said, "but where in Meadowbrook are you going to wear it?" "You never know when a special occasion will come up," Kayla replied, glancing at Richard again. Deborah noticed that her husband blushed. On Friday evening, Deborah decided to conduct a test. She told Richard she was taking an extra shift at the hospital, although she actually planned to return home in an hour to see what was happening. "That's a shame," Richard said, but there was no disappointment in his voice. "I'll go to bed early then." Deborah left, but parked 2 blocks away and walked through the neighborhood. Their house was dark, but Richard's car was in the driveway. She walked around to the back and looked through the living room window. Richard was sitting on the sofa, but he wasn't alone. Kayla was next to him, and she was much closer than a family friend should be. They were talking about something, leaning toward each other, and the atmosphere between them was intimate, charged. Deborah leaned against the wall of the house, feeling the world spin around her. Her hands were shaking, her heart was beating so loudly that she was afraid they would hear it inside the house. When she looked back at the window, Kayla had put her hand on Richard's shoulder. He didn't pull away. On the contrary, he covered her hand with his. Deborah stepped away from the window. She had to leave before she saw something that would completely destroy her world. She made it to her car, trembling all over, and sat there for half an hour before she could start the engine. When she returned home at the appointed time, Kayla was gone. Richard met her at the door. "How was your shift?" he asked, kissing her on the cheek. His lips felt cold, unfamiliar. "Fine," Deborah replied, studying his face. Did he look guilty? Nervous? Or was she just looking for something that wasn't there? "Did anyone come by?" she asked. Kayla stopped by for half an hour. She was looking for Emily, but she forgot she was at book club today. A lie. Deborah knew it was a lie because Emily was at book club on the first Thursday of the month, not Friday. And Kayla knew that better than anyone. She had accompanied Emily to those meetings several times herself. "I see," Deborah said, trying to keep her voice steady. On Saturday morning, after Richard left for the gym, Deborah went into his home office. She had never invaded his privacy, but circumstances had changed. In a desk drawer, under a stack of car dealership documents, she found a receipt from the same expensive store where Kayla had bought her new dress. The date was the same day the girl had come home to show off her purchase. The amount was impressive, almost $300, too much for a dress that Kayla could afford on her waitressing salary. Deborah sat in her husband's office, holding the receipt in her trembling hands. There was no longer any doubt. There was no longer any hope that it was all a figment of her imagination. Her husband was cheating on her, with a girl who was only a year younger than their daughter, with a girl she considered family. The betrayal was twofold, and that made it even more painful. It wasn't just her husband's infidelity. It was the betrayal of a girl she loved like a second daughter. Deborah put the receipt back in the drawer and quietly left the office. She needed time to think, to decide what to do next. But one thing she knew for sure: their perfect family life was over. The only question was what would replace it. The next 2 weeks were torture for Deborah. She continued to play the role of a loving wife and caring mother, but inside her, a hurricane of emotions was raging. Every morning she woke up hoping that it was all just a nightmare, and every night she fell asleep with a heavy weight on her chest, knowing that reality had not changed. Richard acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed her goodbye, told her about work, even brought her flowers on Wednesday, just because. This ostensible normality was worse than an outright lie. Deborah caught herself studying his every gesture, every intonation, trying to understand when he had become such a skilled liar. At the hospital, her colleagues began to notice her distraction. "Deborah, are you okay?" asked head nurse Patricia during the morning meeting. "You look tired." "I'm just not sleeping well," Deborah replied, which was true. Sleep had become a luxury she could no longer afford. "Maybe you should take a few days off?" "No, work helps," Deborah said, and that was also true. Only at the hospital, surrounded by patients and medical chaos, could she forget her problems for a while. Mrs. Johnson from room 12 had been discharged last week, but continued to visit Deborah. The elderly woman had that special intuition that comes with age. "Dear, something's bothering you," she said, sitting down in the chair next to the nurse's station. "I can see it in your eyes." Deborah wanted to brush it off as usual, but suddenly felt tears welling up in her throat. "Sometimes life throws us surprises we don't expect," she said quietly. "Men's surprises?" Mrs. Johnson asked perceptively. Deborah nodded, not trusting her voice. "You know, dear, in 70 years of life, I've learned one thing. Men are simple creatures. They're not as good at keeping secrets as they think they are, and we women see more than we show." "What would you do in my place?" The old woman was silent for a long time, looking at her wrinkled hands. "I would find out the whole truth, not assumptions, not guesses, the truth. And then I would decide whether that truth was worth fighting for." The atmosphere at home was becoming increasingly tense, although Emily hadn't noticed anything yet. Her daughter was busy preparing for the annual book fair at the library, the biggest cultural event in Meadowbrook. "Mom, will you help me with the decorations?" Emily asked, laying out colored paper and scissors on the kitchen table. "Of course, dear," Deborah replied, grateful for the opportunity to do something simple and straightforward. They worked in comfortable silence, cutting out paper flowers and garlands. Deborah watched her daughter, her focused expression, the way she bit her lip when something didn't work out. Emily was the best thing that had ever happened to her. She was willing to endure anything for her daughter. "Kayla said she'd help with the decorations too," Emily said. "She's been so great lately, spending so much time with our family." Deborah almost cut herself with the scissors. "Yes, she's a very thoughtful girl," she said. "You know, sometimes I think she needs a family more than she shows. She never really recovered after her mother died." Deborah nodded, feeling a bitter taste in her mouth. She too had once thought she was helping an orphaned girl find a home and a family. Now she realized she had simply let a destroyer into her home. Kayla did come over to help the next day. She showed up in tight jeans and a low-cut top, declaring that she was ready to get creative. Deborah watched how the girl behaved in Richard's presence. Innocent touches to his hand when she asked him to pass something, flirtatious glances, quiet laughter in response to his jokes. Richard tried to look normal, but Deborah saw his shoulders tense when Kayla got too close. She saw his gaze involuntarily linger on her figure. She saw him blush when their fingers accidentally touched. "Mr. M, you're so good at cutting straight lines," Kayla said, leaning over his shoulder to look at his work. Her hair brushed against his cheek. "Experience," Richard replied hoarsely. Deborah stood up and went out into the garden, afraid she wouldn't be able to control herself. She stood among the fading autumn flowers, breathing deeply of the cold air and trying to calm herself. "Mom?" Emily followed her out. "What's wrong?" "Just getting some fresh air." Emily hugged her shoulders. "You've been acting strange lately. Is something going on?" Deborah looked at her daughter, at her open, trusting face, at her eyes full of love and concern. How could she destroy this world? How could she tell her that the person Emily considered her best friend and the man she considered a model father were betraying them both? "No, sweetheart, I'm just tired from work." But Deborah's patience was running out. Every day of pretending was draining her strength. She was losing weight, dark circles were appearing under her eyes, and her hands were shaking from nervous tension. The turning point came on Saturday. Richard said again that he was going to work, supposedly to finish some paperwork for a big deal. Emily left for her aunt's for the day. Deborah stayed home alone, painfully certain that her husband was lying again. Around noon, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello? Mrs. Miller? This is Jason from the car dealership. I'm sorry to bother you on your day off, but could you please tell Mr. Miller that the documents he was waiting for have arrived? He asked me to let him know right away." "Of course," said Deborah. "But isn't he at work?" "At work? No, ma'am. The dealership is closed today. Mr. Miller said he wouldn't be available until Monday." Deborah slowly put down the phone. So Richard hadn't even tried to hide his lie from his colleagues. He just didn't think anyone would call home. She sat down on the sofa, feeling something inside her break completely. Months of suspicion, weeks of certainty, and now, absolute knowledge. Her husband wasn't just cheating on her. He was doing it openly, brazenly, without fear of being caught. Deborah grabbed her car keys and drove around town. She didn't know where to look for them, but she felt she had to see everything with her own eyes, to be absolutely sure. She drove to all the places they might be. The motel on the outskirts of town, the park by the lake, the abandoned McDonald farm. Nothing. Then she remembered Kayla's old house. After her mother died, the girl sold the house, but the buyers never moved in. The house had been empty for 2 years, surrounded by an overgrown garden and marked by loneliness. Deborah parked 2 blocks away and walked toward the house. Her heart was beating so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. Richard's red Mustang was in the backyard, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Deborah approached the house and looked through the living room window. What she saw changed her life forever. Richard and Kayla were on the old couch that had once belonged to Kayla's mother. They were partially undressed, completely absorbed in each other. Kayla was straddling Richard, her head thrown back, her hair flowing over her shoulders. Richard's arms were wrapped around her waist, his face buried in her neck. Deborah stood frozen, unable to look away from the scene that was destroying everything she believed in. This wasn't a passing infatuation, a momentary weakness. This was passion. This was intimacy. This was something she and Richard hadn't had in years. Kayla whispered something in Richard's ear, and he laughed. That low, intimate laugh that was once meant only for Deborah. Then Kayla kissed him, long and deep, and Deborah saw her husband respond to the kiss with desperate hunger. Deborah stepped away from the window, feeling nauseous. She made it to her car, nearly falling several times, started the engine with trembling hands, and slowly drove home. At home, she sat down in the kitchen and tried to make sense of what she had seen. 24 years of marriage, 24 years of living together, making plans, supporting each other. And all this time, he was capable of such betrayal. But what hurt her most was not that Richard was cheating on her. What hurt her most was that he had chosen Kayla, the girl Deborah loved like a daughter, the girl who ate at their table, slept in their house, shared her secrets and dreams. It was betrayal squared, and Deborah didn't know what hurt more, her husband's infidelity, or the betrayal of someone she considered family. When Richard came home around 6 in the evening, Deborah greeted him with her usual smile. "How was your day?" she asked, studying his face. His hair was slightly tousled, his shirt wrinkled. On his neck, just above the collar, she noticed a reddish mark, the trace of a kiss. "Tired," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "Lots of paperwork. I'm going to take a shower." Deborah nodded and watched him go. Then she quietly went up to the bedroom and waited for the sound of running water. When Richard entered the bathroom, she quickly searched the pockets of his jacket. In his breast pocket, she found what she was looking for, a note written in Kayla's familiar handwriting. "Can't wait for next time. You make me feel alive. Kay." Deborah clenched the note in her fist, feeling tears sting her eyes. There was no longer any doubt. There was no longer any hope for a mistake or misunderstanding. Her husband and her daughter's best friend weren't just cheating on her. They were in love, and that made it even worse. Deborah put the note back in his pocket and went down to the kitchen. She stood at the stove, mechanically stirring dinner, as a plan began to form in her head. Sunday morning brought Deborah a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, she woke up with a clear head and a clear plan of action. The decision came naturally, as if her subconscious had been working out the details all night. She got up at her usual time, around 6 in the morning, and went down to the kitchen. The ritual of making breakfast helped her focus. Coffee, eggs, toast, everything as usual. But today was a special day. Deborah opened the cabinet where she kept her medicines. Among the usual medications, aspirin, vitamins, cold remedies, was a small bottle of digoxin. It was Mrs. Carter's heart medicine. She had died last week. Her relatives had taken all her personal belongings, but the bottle of medicine had somehow remained in her bag. Deborah had planned to return it to the hospital pharmacy for disposal, but now she had other plans. Digoxin in large doses was deadly. It caused cardiac arrhythmia, which looked like a natural death from a heart attack. And Richard had blood pressure problems. Everyone in town knew that. The perfect alibi. Richard came downstairs at 7:30, looking rested. He put his arm around her waist and kissed her neck, and Deborah let him, even though the touch felt repulsive. "Good morning, beautiful." "Good morning," she replied, pouring him coffee. "How did you sleep?" "Wonderfully." "What are your plans for today?" "Just the usual household chores. Maybe I'll cook something special for dinner. You love my beefsteak, don't you?" Richard smiled. "I love it. We haven't had it in a long time." "Then it's settled. I'll get some good meat and make your favorite marinade." They ate breakfast in their usual cozy family setting. Richard read the newspaper, occasionally commenting on the news. Deborah nodded and smiled in the right places, but her mind was already planning the evening. Emily came downstairs around 9, still sleepy. "Good morning, family. What are your plans for Sunday?" "Dad's going to work in the garage," said Deborah. "You and I could go to the mall. We haven't spent time together in a while." "Great idea," Emily exclaimed happily. "I need to buy a present for Sarah from the library. It's her birthday soon." Richard frowned. "I thought we were going to spend the day together as a family." "We'll spend the evening together," Deborah assured him. "I have a special dinner for you." After breakfast, Richard did indeed go to the garage to work on his car. Deborah watched him through the window as he fiddled under the hood of his Mustang, the same Mustang he had driven to see Kayla. "Mom, are you ready?" Emily asked, appearing with her purse. "Of course, dear." At the mall, Deborah was the perfect mother. She helped Emily pick out a gift, drank coffee with her at a cafe, and listened to stories about her job at the library. But all the while, one thought kept running through her mind. By evening, it would all be over. "Mom, you seem different today, kind of peaceful," Emily remarked at dinner. "I'm just in a good mood," Deborah replied. Sometimes life brings clarity in the most unexpected moments. They returned home around 4. Richard was still working in the garage, but he was almost done. Deborah immediately went to the kitchen to prepare dinner. She had bought steaks from the best butcher in town. She prepared a marinade according to a family recipe: soy sauce, garlic, rosemary, and red wine. Richard always said that no one cooked steaks better than Deborah. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The table was set, the candles were lit, and a bottle of good red wine was open. Emily had gone to a friend's house for the evening. Deborah had hinted to her that she wanted to spend a romantic evening with her father. "You've outdone yourself," Richard said, appearing in the kitchen after his shower. "It smells divine." "A special dinner for a special person," Emily replied, and there was no irony in her voice. They sat down at the table as they had done thousands of times in their 24 years of marriage. Richard poured the wine and talked about the car problems he had finally solved. Deborah listened, asked questions, and laughed at the right moments. The perfect wife for the perfect husband. "You know," Richard said, cutting into his steak, "lately I've been thinking that we've been growing apart. Maybe we should spend more time together? Go away somewhere for the weekend, just the two of us?" "That's an interesting idea," Deborah replied. "What about your other commitments?" Richard looked up from his plate. "What other commitments?" "Work. It takes up so much time, especially on Saturdays." "Oh, that. Well, work is work, but family is more important." "Family is more important." Deborah almost laughed. If family was so important, why was he sleeping with a girl who could be his daughter? "Richard, can I ask you a question?" "Of course." "Are you happy in our marriage, I mean?" Richard put down his fork and looked at her intently. What a strange question. "Of course I'm happy. Are you?" "I thought I was happy, but sometimes I wonder if there are things I don't know. Secrets that could change everything." "Deborah, what are you talking about?" "Nothing in particular, just philosophizing." She got up to bring dessert. "I baked your favorite apple pie." In the kitchen, Deborah took the pie and a small bottle of digoxin out of the refrigerator. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady. She crushed a few pills into powder and sprinkled it on Richard's piece of pie. The white powder mixed with the powdered sugar and became invisible. "The pie looks amazing," Richard said when she returned with dessert. "It's a special recipe," Deborah replied. "The secret ingredient." They ate the pie, and Richard praised its taste. Deborah watched him eat every bite, knowing she was signing her own death warrant. Strangely, she felt no remorse, only a cold satisfaction that justice would finally prevail. "Excellent dinner," Richard said, leaning back in his chair. "Thank you, dear." "You're welcome. Coffee?" "I'd love some." Deborah made coffee and sat down across from her husband. Now all she had to do was wait. Digoxin didn't work right away. It could take anywhere from half an hour to an hour before the symptoms started. "Do you remember our first date?" she asked. Richard smiled. "Of course, you were wearing that blue dress, and I was so nervous I spilled coffee on my shirt. Do you remember what you said to me then? Something romantic, I hope. You said you'd never hurt me, that I could trust you." Richard's expression changed. "Deborah, have you kept your promise? All these years?" Richard was silent, studying her face. "What do you want to hear?" "The truth." A long pause. Then Richard rubbed his forehead with his hand. "I think I have a headache." "Maybe you're tired? It's been a long day." "Yes, probably." He stood up, staggering. "I don't feel well." Deborah watched her husband grab the back of a chair. The digoxin was starting to take effect. "Sit down," she said. "Maybe it's your blood pressure?" "Maybe." Richard sank into the chair, his face pale. "My heart feels strange. Do you want me to call the doctor?" No, I'll just sit here for a minute." But it wasn't just a minute. Half an hour later, Richard was feeling very ill. He complained of nausea, dizziness, and irregular heartbeat. Deborah played the caring wife, offering him medicines she knew wouldn't help. "Deborah," Richard croaked, grabbing her hand. "This seems serious. Call an ambulance." "Of course, dear." But she didn't rush. First, she cleared the remains of the digoxin-laced pie from the table and threw them down the garbage chute. She washed the dishes. She hid the medicine bottle back in the medicine cabinet. Only then did she dial 911. "Emergency services? My husband isn't feeling well. I think he's having a heart attack. Yes, he's complaining of chest pains and shortness of breath. Address?" While the ambulance was on its way, Richard lost consciousness. Deborah sat next to him, holding his hand and waiting. When there was a knock at the door, she screamed as if she had just found her husband unconscious. "Help! He's not breathing!" The paramedics worked professionally, but it was too late. The digoxin had done its job. Richard's heart had stopped from the overdose, but to everyone else it looked like a sudden heart attack. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," said the senior paramedic. "We did everything we could." Deborah cried so sincerely that even she believed her own grief. In part, it was true. She wasn't mourning Richard's death, but the death of their marriage, the destruction of everything she believed in. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Sergeant Connor, a local police officer whom everyone knew, asked the standard questions. What happened? How had the deceased been feeling lately? Did he have any health problems? "He had high blood pressure," Deborah sobbed. "The doctor warned him to watch his diet, but Richard didn't listen. He loved fatty foods and didn't exercise much." "I see. Was there anything unusual about tonight?" "Just a normal family dinner. I cooked his favorite steak. We talked and reminisced about old times. Then he started feeling ill." Connor wrote everything down in his notebook. "Will the family doctor confirm the heart problems?" "Dr. Harris has been treating him for 10 years. Richard had high blood pressure and occasional arrhythmia." "Okay. We'll need to conduct a standard investigation, but it looks like a natural death. A heart attack." Deborah nodded, continuing to cry. Inside, she felt a strange sense of relief. Everything had gone perfectly. No one suspected a thing. Emily returned home at 10 o'clock in the evening to find the house full of people, police, neighbors, family friends. When Deborah told her what had happened, the girl collapsed to the floor. "No, it's not true. Dad can't be dead." Deborah hugged her daughter, feeling real grief for her pain. Emily had lost her father, and that was a real tragedy, regardless of what kind of man he was. "I know, sweetheart. I know how much it hurts." Kayla arrived half an hour after the news had spread throughout the town. She burst into the house with her eyes red from crying. "Is it true? Mr. M, really?" "Yes," Deborah replied, watching the girl's reaction. "Heart attack." Kayla sobbed so loudly that everyone turned around. Her grief seemed genuine, even excessive for a family friend. But Deborah understood. The girl had lost not just a family friend, but a lover. "He was so young," Kayla sobbed. "How could this happen?" "The heart," Deborah replied simply. "Sometimes it just stops." Late in the evening, when everyone had left, Deborah was alone with Emily. Her daughter had fallen asleep on the sofa in the living room, exhausted from grief. Deborah covered her with a blanket and sat down next to her. Richard was dead. Their marriage had ended not in divorce and scandal, but in death. Emily would never know about her father's betrayal. Their family reputation would remain unblemished. Deborah picked up the photo from the table, their wedding photo from 24 years ago. Young, happy, full of hope. When did it all start to go wrong? She took the photo to the kitchen and put it in a drawer. Tomorrow, a new life would begin. The life of a widow, a life without lies and betrayal. Maybe even a better life. Deborah turned off the light and went upstairs. The bedroom still smelled of Richard's cologne. She opened the window, letting in the cold night air. Monday morning brought with it that special kind of silence that descends on a house after a death. Deborah woke up in an empty bedroom and for a moment forgot what had happened. Then her memory returned, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Emily didn't go to work. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of untouched coffee, staring into space with tear-stained eyes. "Mom, I still can't believe it," she said when Deborah came downstairs. "Last night he was alive, and today—" "I know, sweetheart." Deborah hugged her daughter. Heart attacks happen suddenly. Even doctors can't always predict them. But he didn't complain of chest pains. He didn't say he wasn't feeling well. Men often hide their health problems. Your father didn't want to worry us. It was true, though not in the context Emily had meant. Richard had indeed kept a lot from his family. The doorbell interrupted their conversation. Deborah opened the door and saw Detective James Connor standing there with a notepad in his hands. "Mrs. Miller, my condolences. I didn't want to disturb you at this time, but I have a few formal questions." "Of course, come in." Connor was a typical small-town cop, a sturdy man in his mid-40s with piercing eyes and a manner of speaking that was both reassuring and alert. He had been working in Meadowbrook for 20 years and knew every family in town. "How are you holding up?" he asked, sitting down at the kitchen table. "We're trying," Deborah replied. It's such a shock. Richard seemed so healthy, full of life. I understand. Unfortunately, heart attacks often happen without warning. Connor opened his notebook. I need to ask you a few standard questions for the report. Last night you said your husband had blood pressure problems? Yes. Dr. Harris prescribed medication, but Richard didn't like to take it. He said he felt fine. Had he complained of feeling unwell recently? Chest pains, shortness of breath? Deborah pretended to think. He sometimes said he was getting tired more quickly than usual, but I thought it was because of work. It's a busy time of year at the car dealership. I see. Was there anything unusual last night? Any stressful situations or arguments? No, not at all. Just a normal family dinner. I made his favorite steak and we talked about our plans for the weekend. Deborah's voice faltered. Everything was so normal, so ordinary. And then he suddenly turned pale and said he wasn't feeling well. How much time passed between the first symptoms and your call to the ambulance? 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. At first I thought it was fatigue. I suggested he rest and take his blood pressure medication. But he was getting worse. Connor wrote down every word. Where was your daughter at the time? At a friend's house. She came back around 10 and found him. Deborah didn't finish her sentence. Mrs. Miller, this may seem insensitive, but I have to ask. Have you and your husband had any problems lately? Any family conflicts? Deborah looked at him with genuine surprise. Problems? No, of course not. We've been married for 24 years. Sure, we had our little disagreements, like all married couples, but nothing serious. Any financial difficulties? No. Richard earned a good living, and I work too. We have savings, and the house is almost paid off. Connor nodded. I'm sorry for these questions. It's standard procedure in cases of sudden death. I understand. You're just doing your job. After the detective left, Deborah felt the first pangs of anxiety. The questions had been standard, but Connor's attentiveness had made her wary. He clearly wasn't just filling out paperwork. The rest of the day was spent receiving condolences. Neighbors brought food, colleagues from the hospital called to offer their help. The whole town was talking about Richard Miller's sudden death. In a small town, events like this became the main topic of conversation for weeks. Mrs. Johnson arrived around noon with a homemade pie and words of comfort. Honey, I know how hard this is for you. Losing a husband is like losing a part of yourself. Thank you, Deborah replied. And the tears in her eyes were real. She had indeed lost a part of herself, the part that believed in love and honesty. Richard was a good man. Everyone in town respected him. Deborah nodded, not trusting her voice. If Mrs. Johnson knew the truth about the good man. Kayla showed up around 3 in the afternoon. She looked terrible, red eyes, pale face, trembling hands. She hugged Deborah and burst into tears. Mrs. M, I'm so sorry. I can't believe he's gone. Deborah watched Kayla's reaction with cold interest. The girl's grief seemed genuine, but was it appropriate? Too intense for a family friend? He was like a father to me, Kayla sobbed. After my mom died, you became my family. And now, we're still your family, Deborah said softly. Death doesn't change that. Kayla looked up at her gratefully. You're so kind. I don't know what I'd do without you. Emily hugged her friend. We'll get through this together. Dad would want us to support each other. Deborah looked at the two girls, her daughter, who was genuinely grieving the loss of her father, and Kayla, who was mourning the loss of her lover. The irony of the situation was almost comical. That evening, after Kayla had left and Emily had fallen asleep from emotional exhaustion, Deborah was left alone with her thoughts. She took the bottle of digoxin out of the medicine cabinet and stared at it for a long time. Tomorrow, she would return it to the hospital, saying she had found it among the deceased patient's belongings. The ringing of the phone interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Miller? This is Dr. Harris. I wanted to offer my condolences and discuss some formalities. Thank you, doctor. What do you need? Detective Connor called me about Richard's medical history. I confirmed the blood pressure issues, but I must say that the test results from 6 months ago showed significant improvement. The new medication was working well. Deborah felt a chill in her stomach. What do you mean? Richard had been taking his medication regularly for the past few months. His blood pressure was stable, as was his heart rate. Of course, that doesn't rule out a sudden attack, but what? Nothing specific. It's just surprising that it happened so suddenly. I would recommend an autopsy to rule out other causes. Deborah gasped. An autopsy? Is that really necessary? Not necessarily if the family objects, but in cases of sudden death in a relatively young person, it's standard procedure. I need to think about it. I need to talk to Emily. Of course, take your time. After talking to the doctor, Deborah couldn't sleep. An autopsy would reveal digoxin in Richard's system, and then the questions would start. Where did the medication come from? How did it get into his system? The next morning brought new worries. Detective Connor knocked on the door again, but this time he was accompanied by a woman in a suit.
Mrs. Miller, this is Detective Rodriguez from the Homicide Division. Could we talk?
Deborah's heart raced, but she remained calm on the outside.
Of course, but I don't understand why a homicide detective is needed. My husband died of a heart attack.
That's what we're trying to determine, Rodriguez said, sitting down at the table. Dr. Harris has expressed some doubts about the cause of your husband's death. What doubts? According to him, Mr. Miller's health had improved significantly in recent months. A sudden heart attack seems unexpected. Deborah feigned surprise. But heart attacks happen even to healthy people, don't they? Absolutely. That's why we'd like to conduct a more thorough investigation, including an autopsy. An autopsy? Emily, who had been listening to the conversation, turned pale. But why? Dad's dead. An autopsy won't bring him back to life. It will help us determine the exact cause of death, Rodriguez explained gently, and rule out any extraneous factors. Extraneous factors? Deborah leaned forward. What do you mean? The possibility of poisoning, for example. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Emily gasped. Poisoning? Who would poison Dad? And why? We're not saying anyone did, Connor said quickly. We're just ruling out all possibilities. Deborah felt the walls closing in around her, but she couldn't back down. I agree to the autopsy, she said firmly. I want to know the truth about my husband's death. Rodriguez nodded. Thank you for your understanding. The results will be ready in a few days. After the detectives left, Emily was hysterical. Mom, how can they think Dad was poisoned? Who could have done that? I don't know, honey. Maybe they're just being cautious. But Deborah knew she didn't have much time. Once the toxicology report revealed digoxin, serious questions would start. She had to prepare. On Wednesday, the autopsy results were in. The detectives returned, but this time their faces were grim. Mrs. Miller, we need to have a serious talk, Rodriguez said. A lethal dose of digoxin was found in your husband's system. Digoxin? Deborah tried to look puzzled. What is that? It's a heart medication. In therapeutic doses, it treats arrhythmia. In large doses, it causes cardiac arrest. But how did this medication get into Richard's system? Dr. Harris didn't prescribe it. That's exactly what we're trying to find out. Connor opened his notebook. Mrs. Miller, as a nurse, are you familiar with digoxin? Of course, we use it in the cardiology department. And do you have access to this medication? Deborah realized she was trapped. Denying it was pointless. It was too easy to verify. Yes, but only at the hospital. We're not allowed to take medication out. What if a patient dies and there are unused drugs left over? They have to be disposed of through the hospital pharmacy. They have to, Rodriguez repeated. And does that always happen? Deborah was silent, knowing that every word could be used against her. Mrs. Miller, Connor said gently, we know about the problems in your marriage. What problems? But Deborah's voice faltered. Neighbors have seen your husband leaving frequently in the evenings. They saw his car near Kayla Thompson's house. Emily turned pale. What do you mean? Deborah closed her eyes. Everything was falling apart. Your father was cheating on your mother, Rodriguez said bluntly. With Kayla Thompson. But Emily screamed and ran out of the room. Deborah remained seated at the table, feeling the last remnants of her carefully constructed world crumble into pieces. Even if it's true, she said quietly, that doesn't mean I killed him. No, Rodriguez agreed, but it does provide a motive. On Thursday morning, Deborah Miller was arrested on charges of first-degree murder. When the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she felt a strange sense of relief. The game was over. The trial was set for 3 months later. Deborah hired the best lawyer she could afford, but the evidence was irrefutable. Digoxin in the victim's system, the defendant's access to the drug, a motive for infidelity, Kayla testified, sobbing on the witness stand. She talked about her affair with Richard, how they had planned to be together. Emily sat in the courtroom looking at her mother with a look of complete incomprehension. "I loved him," Kayla said. "We loved each other. No one should have died." The verdict was predictable: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Deborah looked at Emily. Her daughter was crying, not out of grief, but out of shame. She had lost not only her father, but also her mother, and she had learned the truth that would forever change her view of family. In her prison cell, Deborah often thought about the evening when it all began, about the Sunday dinner that was supposed to be a normal family evening, about the decision that seemed the only possible one at the time. Justice had prevailed, but not as she had planned. Richard was dead, but his betrayal was now public knowledge. Emily knew the truth about her father, but now she hated her mother. Kayla was free, but she carried the burden of guilt for her lover's death.